He was the mind America feared most, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the strategist who believed he could break a nation before it ever had the chance to fight back. But on one quiet April morning in 1943, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto boarded a transport plane, certain that no enemy could possibly reach him. What he didn't know was that 16 American pilots were already in the sky, flying straight into the jaws of the Japanese Empire, on a mission so precise, so dangerous, that it should never have succeeded. This is the story of the hunt for Yamamoto, a mission history remembers as the impossible made real.
Before Operation Vengeance ever took shape, the Pacific was already drowning in fire. By early 1943, entire island chains had become graveyards of twisted steel and shattered lives. Japanese carriers burned in the Coral Sea. American ships rested silent on the ocean floor. The promise of a quick war had vanished. And at the center of this hurricane stood one man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. To Japan, he was a brilliant strategist, the calm architect of their early victories. To America, he was the shadow behind Pearl Harbor, the mind that awakened a sleeping giant. Yet Yamamoto carried a burden few around him understood. He knew Japan could not outlast the industrial power of the United States. He warned political leaders that war would spiral beyond control. But still, he followed orders, guiding Japan through decisions that pushed both nations deeper into chaos. By 1943, he traveled constantly across the front lines, trying to restore morale, speaking directly to pilots, sailors, and commanders. And that constant movement eventually exposed him. In a cramped and dimly lit code-breaking station, American cryptographers intercepted a Japanese transmission. Precise, detailed, impossible to believe. It listed Yamamoto's full travel itinerary, the date, the time, the route, even the aircraft he would board. For the first time in the war, the United States had a chance to strike directly at the mastermind of Pearl Harbor. But doing so meant sending pilots deep into enemy skies, on a mission with almost no chance of survival. It was a moment that would reshape the Pacific War, and it began with a message decoded in absolute silence.
When the decoded message reached the American command post on Guadalcanal, the room fell silent. It was the kind of intelligence officers only dreamed of, the exact travel plan of the most protected man in the Japanese Empire. Some believed it had to be a trap, too perfect, too detailed, but the cryptographers insisted the code was authentic, and the message was real. Admiral Yamamoto would be flying over Bougainville at precisely 9:34 a.m. in a slow, unarmed transport plane escorted by a handful of fighters. The information was rushed to Washington. When President Franklin Roosevelt was briefed, he didn't hesitate. After everything Yamamoto had orchestrated, Pearl Harbor, the early Pacific offensives, the months of blood and chaos, Roosevelt gave a simple order, one that would echo through history: get Yamamoto. But turning that command into reality was another matter entirely. The target was deep inside Japanese-controlled territory. Too far for most American aircraft, too dangerous for conventional escorts, too precise to risk guesswork. Only one fighter in the American arsenal had the speed, the range, and the endurance to reach Yamamoto's bomber, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The mission would require 16 pilots. Each one would have to fly over 400 miles of open ocean, at wave-top height, without radio chatter, and without the slightest navigational error. It was, by every definition, a suicide operation. Yet when the roster was posted, not a single pilot stepped back. They all volunteered to fly into the lion's den because they knew exactly who they were going after.
Dawn broke over Guadalcanal with a thin veil of mist hanging over the jungle. The airfield was quiet, far too quiet for what was about to begin. At 7:25 a.m., the engines of 16 P-38 Lightnings roared to life, trembling under the weight of extra fuel tanks and ammunition. The ground crew stepped back, watching in tense silence as the aircraft lined up for takeoff. One by one, the lightnings lifted into the sky and immediately dropped down to just 50 feet above the water. Any higher, and Japanese radar would spot them long before they reached Bougainville. For the next 2 hours, the pilots flew in absolute silence. No radio calls, no corrections, just the endless stretch of the Pacific beneath them, and the thin hope that their dead-reckoning calculations were correct. They skimmed so low that their propellers seemed to slice the tops of the waves. Salt spray coated the windshields. Every tiny course correction had to be perfect, because a single degree off over open ocean could mean missing Yamamoto by miles. The sun climbed higher. Fuel burned away. The air grew hotter inside the cramped cockpits. But none of the pilots broke formation. None climbed higher. None hesitated. Ahead of them, somewhere beyond the shimmering horizon, was the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, unaware that 16 silent hunters were carving their way toward him. Their watches ticked closer to 9:34 a.m., the exact moment Yamamoto's bomber was scheduled to appear. If their timing was off by even a minute, the mission would fail. But if they were right, history would change in the next heartbeat. At 9:32 a.m., the formation reached the interception point, a patch of sky so empty and quiet that it felt impossible anything could appear there. The pilots scanned the horizon, straining their eyes through the misty morning glare. Seconds felt like minutes. The silence grew heavier, until one voice finally broke through the radio, a single word that electrified the entire formation. Bogies! Tiny silver shapes emerged from the distant blue. 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers and 6 Zero fighters, escorting them in a tight defensive shell. Yamamoto was here, right on schedule, exactly where the codebreakers predicted. The American formation split instantly. Half would dive to keep the escorting Zeros busy. The other half, the kill team, would drive straight for the bombers. The sky erupted in an instant. The Zeros dove down like streaks of white fire, their cannons spitting tracers across the ocean. P-38 Lightnings twisted upward to meet them, engines screaming as metal clashed with metal in a deadly ballet. Captain Thomas Lanphier spotted the lead bomber, Yamamoto's plane, gliding steadily at a few thousand feet. He shoved his throttle forward. His P-38 roared ahead, climbing hard, pushing against the limits of the airframe. The bomber's escort turned toward him, but they were seconds too late. Lanphier rolled his aircraft onto its side, lined up the shot, and squeezed the trigger. A torrent of .5 caliber fire poured from his guns, tearing across the bomber's right wing and into its engines. Smoke gushed out. Flames erupted. The silver fuselage shuddered violently. In the chaos of battle, no one could say the words aloud, but every pilot who saw it understood what had just happened. Yamamoto's state was sealed in the sky.
The stricken bomber drifted away from the battle, each second sinking lower toward the dense green jungle of Bougainville. Its burning engine left a long, black scar across the morning sky. Inside the cockpit, Japanese crew members struggled to keep the aircraft level, but the damage was too great. The plane dipped, rolled, and began a slow, spiraling descent. On the ground below, villagers and Japanese soldiers heard the growing roar overhead. Moments later, the bomber burst through the treetops, tearing a path of shattered branches before crashing deep inside the jungle with a thunderous impact. When Japanese search teams arrived hours later, the wreckage was still smoldering. Twisted metal lay scattered across the forest floor. Beneath a large tree, seated upright as if still alive, they found Admiral Yamamoto. His cap rested neatly on his head, his ceremonial sword beside him.
A single bullet wound had pierced his shoulder and passed through his heart. He had died instantly. The soldiers who discovered him stood in silence. Even amidst the brutality of war, they understood the weight of the moment. Japan had lost not only its most brilliant commander, but the one man who truly understood the cost of the conflict he tried to prevent. They carried his body out of the jungle with quiet reverence, as the Pacific War took a darker turn without him.
The news of Yamamoto's death did not reach the public immediately. In fact, Japan hid it for weeks, terrified that the loss of their most respected commander would crush morale across the empire. But inside military headquarters, the impact was immediate. Officers who relied on Yamamoto's calm discipline suddenly found themselves facing decisions they were not prepared to make. The steady hand that once guided Japan's naval strategy was gone. Across the Pacific, American pilots returned to Guadalcanal exhausted, shaken, and nearly out of fuel. Some landed with empty tanks, others limped in with wings torn by enemy fire. They did not celebrate, they did not shout in triumph. One pilot later said, "It didn't feel like victory, it felt like we had simply survived." But the truth was undeniable. Operation Vengeance had succeeded in a way no mission of its kind ever had. Yamamoto's absence began reshaping Japan's decisions almost immediately. Without his influence, the naval command fractured into competing voices, some urging caution, others pushing for reckless offensives that drained precious resources. The battles that followed, the Solomons, the Marianas, the Philippine Sea, would prove just how deeply Yamamoto's loss wounded Japan's ability to fight a coordinated war. Operation Vengeance did not end the conflict. It did not stop the bloodshed. But it stripped Japan of its most brilliant strategist and accelerated the unraveling of an empire already stretched to the breaking point. In war, some blows are physical, others are fatal in ways no one sees until it is too late. In the weeks that followed, American intelligence monitored Japanese radio traffic closely. At first, everything was routine, then suddenly, transmissions shifted. Encrypted messages carried words they had been waiting for, confirmation of Yamamoto's death. For a moment, commanders on Guadalcanal simply stared at each other. The impossible mission had truly succeeded. But even then, the mood was not celebratory. The pilots knew what they had done. They had struck down a symbol, a leader, a man many considered honorable despite the uniform he wore. Some historians would later argue that Yamamoto's death shortened the war. Others believed it pushed Japan into more desperate, irrational decisions that prolonged the suffering. Even today, the debate continues. What cannot be debated is the price paid by the men who carried out the mission. They returned to base with trembling hands, salt-crusted faces, and engines barely holding together. Not one of them escaped the crushing fatigue, the kind that sinks into a person's bones after staring death in the eyes for hours. And yet, every pilot knew they had taken part in something far larger than themselves. They had flown farther, lower, and quieter than anyone believed possible. They had challenged fate and lived. Operation Vengeance became a blueprint for precision strikes and long-range interception missions for decades to come. A reminder that sometimes the smallest decision, a coded message, a volunteer signature, a single volley of gunfire, can alter the course of an entire war. But beneath all the strategy and historical analysis, the mission remained deeply human. A story not of hatred, but of determination. Not of glory, but of duty.
Today, the cockpit of Yamamoto's downed bomber is almost swallowed by the jungle of Bougainville. Vines creep through the broken fuselage. The metal is rusted and fading. Nature is slowly erasing the scars of that morning in 1943. But history remembers. It remembers 16 American pilots who flew into enemy skies with no promise of returning. It remembers the cryptographers who uncovered the message that changed everything. It remembers a commander who tried to warn his nation, but was carried forward by a war he could no longer control. Operation Vengeance remains one of World War II's most precise, daring, and controversial missions. A moment where strategy, sacrifice, and fate collided in a single flash of gunfire high above the Pacific. And long after the jungle has taken the last fragments of the wreckage, the story endures. Because some moments in war are not measured in victories or losses, but in the impossible choices made by those who lived them.